What if everything you thought you knew about ADHD is just scratching the surface? Today, we're breaking through the stereotypes and diving into the untold story of ADHD in women. My guest, Danielle Elliot, is a dynamic documentarian and journalist and host of the podcast series Climbing the Walls. She's here to share the real story behind her late diagnosis, the struggles of masking, and the liberating journey to self-discovery. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or like you're missing a piece of the puzzle, this episode is for you. Welcome to Make It a Great One with Dr. Dan. I'm Dan Peters, psychologist and leadership coach. This show is all about bringing hope, connection, awareness, and wisdom through meaningful conversations that inspire us to be better versions of ourselves and have a positive impact on humanity. This is your space to pause, reflect, and reconnect with who you are, what you care about, and who you want to be. We have this moment, this day, and this life. Let's make it a great one. Today's show is Climbing the Walls, the rise of ADHD in women with Danielle Elliot. Danielle is a documentarian and writer. She focuses on character-driven narratives that seek to explain cultural phenomena. Her films, features, and series have appeared on HBO, ESPN, FX, iHeart, Audible, NBC, and more. After earning a Master's of Arts degree from the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, she became science editor at CBSNews.com and began writing long-form features for The Atlantic, The New York Times, National Geographic, Nautilus, Popular Mechanics, and many others. She also works with documentary filmmakers to develop and structure films and series, and with Fortune 100 brands to direct and produce docu-style campaigns. Danielle is the host of the new Understood podcast series, Climbing the Walls, which we are going to dive into. Danielle, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. I'm very happy to be here. I'm excited for this conversation.
You have, first of all, your podcast is awesome. Like, it
Thank you.
is awesome. I'm just so excited to talk to you about it and let everyone who doesn't know about it know about it. I, wanted to dabble in preparation. No dabbling. I was in every episode and I was like waiting for the next one and waiting for the next one. And it has been a journey.
I'm so excited to hear that you like it. Yeah, it's been a journey making it. So I'm excited to talk about it. Yeah.
How much of your, we're going to get into the journey of how this happened. How much of your journey continued through your investigations and through the interviews? I felt like some of it was happening in process for you.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. There were a couple of people who I had read their books sort of within the first year of being diagnosed. So I would say maybe the beginning of the podcast is a little bit of reliving it, but I had so many questions for these authors. So the opportunity to actually sit down with them for, the episodes last a half hour, and that's a combination of narration and interview. I think I was with each of the interview subjects for 4 or 5 hours. So it was amazing. And I think I learned a lot more about ADHD in the process of reporting the show. And a lot more about the factors that are contributing to the rise, which were my original questions, but also, as the journey went on, my original questions or initial questions sort of started to take a backseat to, well, what do we do about this now? Like, there might still be a lot of debate around the numbers and the accuracy of the rate of diagnosis, but that sort of starts to move aside when you're like, but ultimately everyone who's seeking a diagnosis is seeking help, whether, like, this is a form of seeking help. And that tells us something, a very big something about our culture and our society right now.
Let's frame this up for everyone.
Okay.
The origin story, your origin story, which for so many, COVID sets the stage for lots of realizations and changes. So tell everyone how this came about for you.
Yeah, so it's actually sort of towards the tail end of COVID. throughout COVID, I was in a relationship, and it was my first really serious relationship, and that ended, and it was coming to a very natural end point. And yet, the night that it ended, my ex, the guy I was dating at the time, initiated the conversation, and my reaction was so strong that it shocked me, especially because, like I said, it was coming to this natural ending. It wasn't the first time we discussed it. It was just the I ultimately I um, I'm very into trying to understand my brain, and finally arrived at it was the rejection that I felt that night that I was most likely reacting to. And I just started Googling like extreme reactions to rejection. And I came across something called rejection sensitivity or rejection sensitive dysphoria. And the article says it's extremely common in people with ADHD. And that was the moment for me where I said, wait, do I have ADHD? Like, this is what? And I started reading more about ADHD. I felt like I was reading about myself. And that's sort of the origin of then I talked to I was seeing a therapist at the time. I talked to her about
Mhm.
it. She put me in touch with a psychiatrist who I don't think the diagnosis took more than 10 minutes. Because it was just so, I mean, we were on the phone for an hour, but it was a very quick, like, she sort of felt that I was a textbook case
Mm,
of adult ADHD and especially undiagnosed ADHD in adult women. So that's sort of
mhm.
my starting point for this whole journey of the last 4 years.
And that was about age 36, right?
Yeah, I
Or
was 36. I was going to turn, that was around January, February, and I was turning 37 in April. So
okay,
36 on the
okay,
brink of 37. Yeah.
37. Right,
Yeah.
so there has to be this, "Wait a second, I'm, like, 36, 37 years old, I've gone through school, I have my career, and yeah, I've got my, like, quirks and my uniqueness and my personality, but how is this possible that this is the first time that it's coming up, and it's coming up because you found it?"
hmm Yeah, I remember saying to my therapist, like, not only how did we miss this in me, but based on what she was telling me and what I was reading, I was like, how did we miss this an entire generation of women? And,
Mhm,
you know, like some of the people that I speak to in the podcast joked with me when I said, I'm from New Jersey. We talk really fast. We talk with our hands, like I'm doing right now. Like there's a lot
mhm,
of Sari Solden, who's an absolute expert in ADHD in women. Her husband's from New Jersey, and she was like, "Oh, there's a lot of crossover in ADHD behaviors and just New Jersey quirks." So I think to your point, there's sort of like
yeah,
this thing you're going through where you're like, "Oh, I had no idea that there was actually a way to explain a lot of what I do." I also am very similar to my mom, and we've now realized she probably also has
right,
ADHD. But
right,
but yeah, there's all these things, and like the question that kept coming up for me was, um, I'm pretty hard on myself about stuff, and I think that's pretty common with ADHD. But I'm pretty hard on myself, and I kept thinking, I've been a science journalist for 10 years. I've been paying attention. Yeah, the question was sort of for myself, like, how did I never put all of this together? But as I dug deeper into it, it was sort of similar to when someone's saying, why can't I hold down a job, but they're working in an industry that keeps falling out from under them? You know what I mean? Like, it's like
mhm,
not actually
mhm,
individually driven. The
mhm.
information wasn't out there in the same way until fairly recently. Um, it was
Well,
there, but you
so
had to
male
really go
dominant.
looking for it. Yeah.
You had to
Yeah.
really dig, and there's always these cultural, socio-political reasons, that things get out there or things don't get out there, and as you point out, there was basically no rise in diagnoses for, like, 30 years, and then all of a sudden, with COVID and TikTok and social media, which we'll get into all of that and the impact, positive, negative, and neutral, that, there's this huge rise. So it's not like this didn't just happen. So then you start digging into what are all the reasons this has been
hmm
dormant and quiet for a whole gender.
Right, for a whole gender for 30 years, and it because it really was something that fascinated me was that I was really almost a year and a half into I would say a year and a few months into knowing about my ADHD before someone told me about the book written by Sari Solden, and when I was reading the
Mhm.
book, I was like, this has everything in it. When was this written? And I looked up the publication date and it's from the 90s. And you read it and you're like, wait, this was always known? Why wasn't this part of the medical
Hmm.
conversation on it? But then to your question, then we arrive at this moment where I would say multiple forces all collide, right? So you have TikTok, which is distributing information faster and further and getting past any sort of gatekeeping that might exist. Like TikTok is bringing the information to people right in the palm of their hand at a time when a lot of people have a lot, well, it's like a lot more time in the pandemic, but also no
Hmm.
time in a way. And they're trying to figure
Hmm.
out just how to balance that. And then the pandemic also stripped away the structures that, like, for so long, I think something that's been incorrect about the narrative of ADHD is that the primary treatment, like even when I got diagnosed, I was seeking a diagnosis because I thought the only way to treat ADHD was medication. And it's really like a very individualized combination of medication and lifestyle adjustments. But a lot of people have lifestyle adjustments they never even realize they have. Like they have coping mechanisms. And suddenly the
Right.
pandemic stripped away all of the structures that people might rely on. And then they were just stuck with their own brains trying to figure out what to, right? Like how to cope. And I think taken out of their normal settings, they were able to recognize there's something going on here. And when they sought information, many people landed on, oh, this is just
Hmm.
ADHD. And it's
Hmm.
not what we've been taught that it is all of these years. Yeah.
And it's just another example of in the medical, psychological, psychiatric communities, we're still learning. Like
Mhm.
we're still trying to figure stuff out. And I to draw a parallel for me is when there's adult diagnoses, let's say a PTSD, and then we're trying to apply those diagnoses, those diagnostic criteria to children, and then we realize, well, it looks different in children, and now we have to
Mhm.
look at different criteria for the same phenomenon in children. It's a very similar thing that we're finding with autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, male and female. Of course, there's overlap. And of course,
Mhm.
there are some that present in traditional ways across genders, but we're finding more and more it looks very different. So if we're not looking at that and don't have that knowledge and we don't have that awareness, we're just flat out missing it and or calling it something else, which you've
Mhm.
found a lot of people were being called something else.
Yes, a lot of people were being misdiagnosed, and especially a lot of women were being diagnosed with anxiety or depression when they might have anxiety or depression, but in a lot of cases it was the root cause was untreated ADHD. And that went
Right.
on for decades. And I think and you know, throughout the podcast, we're talking about all of these things, but like you said, the medical field's always learning. That's the need for research, right? So it's not a knock on everyone who's been researching it for years. It's just that you can only arrive at information by continuing to study. And it's never
Hmm.
going to look the same.
Hmm.
I think for a long time, the medical research community had somewhat of an assumption that you can study. I mean, for a long time, they just studied adult men. Like, let's be honest. Like, that's where
Right.
I'm like trying to
Right.
figure out the right way to
Right.
say this, but you could study men and it would tell you what's happening with women. And
Hmm.
we've really caught on in the last 30 years to the fact that that's not necessarily true. It's often not true,
No.
especially when you look at Alzheimer's research. That's a really fascinating area to look at, what's happening with the brain and individualized treatments
Hmm.
that are becoming more gendered as the research helps us understand it. But yeah.
Hmm. And just the role and expectation of being um, a woman in our society. So let's just take a step back. So first of
Mhm.
all, there's um, you're supposed to act a certain way, and you're supposed to cover all your bases, and
Mhm.
so like there's that, and then there is the so there's that masking, and I want to say there's a double masking which applies to you and many of the people you know, which are very bright women, very bright individuals also mask. right? So you find a way to get through school, you excel, you do it your own way, and it's a double mask, right? So I feel like it really can make it difficult to pick this stuff up, which is why, in my experience too, has been that so many um, female teenagers and women are the ones that basically are coming forward and saying, "Hey, can you? I need an evaluation. I
Hmm.
need like this is what I think's going on." Where it's just not being picked up often. I think it is more and more now with this kind of awareness, but it's been missed a lot.
Yeah, I think it has been missed a lot, and I think that that masking, especially for women, I just turned 40, and I think a lot of women our age, it was like I would say women I speak to who are about 8 years younger, that seems to be the mark. The symptoms were somewhat recognized in their childhood. But
Hmm.
there's something about like 32 and up right now that the symptoms weren't really recognized, and I think a lot of that is masking. I
Hmm.
think a lot of it is, I mean, for a lot of us, it pops up in dating where there's a lot of the expectations on women in heterosexual relationships, like for better or worse, just the way we've done things culturally for a really long time. It's like I was never going to be the more organized partner. Like it just like wasn't, but it's kind of just like an expectation on um or even
The
like there's
traditional
a
gender role, yeah,
yeah,
traditional
exactly.
gender role.
Traditional gender roles, I think, can compound the symptoms of ADHD for a lot of women, but then they're trying to mask it because they're trying to prove that, or we're trying to prove like we can be good partners as you're thinking of us.
Mhm.
But yeah, traditional gender roles definitely, and then the attempt to mask to meet those expectations has definitely
Mhm.
hindered the evaluation
Mhm.
process for a lot of women.
One of the many important um, themes and concepts in the podcast and talking to the women who are leaders in the field who also have ADHD, which is how they came to it,
Hmm.
as well as the women at the camp and the other places that you have interviewed, is the shame, right? The it's like the shrapnel, and I think this is so important to talk about because diagnoses are a tricky thing, and those of us who give them hopefully try to be very thoughtful and affirming as opposed to pathologizing.
Hmm.
And so there seems like there's some, first of all, acknowledging the shrapnel and the consequences of not knowing this is part of the
Hmm.
neurodiversity, um, as well as the liberation of having a reason.
Yeah, I think that some of that shrapnel, it's interesting to see. I do think that the field has changed in the last 30 years, right? Like there's someone who Sari Solden, she was treating someone in the 90s who ultimately got tested, and it used to be a full neuropsych evaluation. It's a bit less complicated now, but the woman's doctor prescribed Ritalin and essentially said, I might not get the quote perfect, but essentially said, well, now you can clean houses again. And it
Right.
was sort of like that was the reason to treat. And then the shame that
Wow.
comes with like not being an organized person or not having strong, a lot of this comes down to strong executive functioning skills, which it's just kind of, those are the ones where I think executive functioning tends to be assumed to be a female trait in certain ways in certain settings, and the shame that comes with not being the good executive functioner, like I to put it into a sort of more everyday example, it's like to be the mom that's not good at keeping up with your kid's schedule, like there's a lot of shame attached to that. And yeah, and I think what Sari Solden and Terry Matlin and a lot of the pioneers in treating women with ADHD have recognized is that you also have to help women with that underlying shame and just help them understand that it wasn't their own personal deficit, that some of it is society's deficit and expectations on women, that it
Yeah.
and that needs to be treated. Like the emotional toll, I think, is the another way of saying the shrapnel. And treating that emotional
Yeah.
impact is a huge part of treating women with ADHD.
Absolutely. And as you talk about, there's women, I mean, up into their 80s getting diagnosed in some cases, and then there's this. I mean, this is why this awareness is so important because it becomes the grief of lost potential, right?
Mhm.
Like people looking back on their lives with now diagnosis and maybe age 60, age 50, getting executive functioning coaching, getting therapy on stimulant medication, and seeing how their life is
Mhm.
feeling more in control, and they're able to achieve their goals, and then looking back and like, what could have been?
Yeah, and I think anyone who's diagnosed, I mean, I of course can't speak for everyone who's diagnosed, but I think that there is a sort of mourning period that happens. Like when I was first diagnosed, I almost didn't want to hear it because I didn't want to think there would have been a way to have a smoother career. Like I kind of there's things that I deeply regret career-wise, and yeah, it was hard to hear that there's probably ways that I could have been coached through all of that in my 20s instead of not knowing until I was 36. And there's that feeling of what if. Um, I'm at the same time, there's a woman I speak to. The camp that you're referring to is a camp for families with ADHD. And as soon as I heard that it existed, I thought, I bet a lot of the women at this camp will have been recently diagnosed. Like even if they're there for their children, I have a feeling, and
Mhm.
it did work out that way. And but towards the end of that episode, I speak with a woman who's actually there. She's a grandmother and she's there with her daughter and granddaughters. And she put it into perspective for me. I think that it's like, yes, I wish I had been diagnosed before I was 36. I'm glad I was diagnosed. I was lucky enough to be diagnosed before I kind of embarked on being a parent. And I think that the self awareness that comes with now understanding how my brain works will be a tremendous help in parenting. Um, but I think if
Mhm.
getting the diagnosis at any age, like the woman who I was speaking to in that episode is in her 70s, and she was actually diagnosed in her 50s or early 60s, but no one did anything about it until now she's pursuing treatment because she's seeing how much it's helping her granddaughters. And she does
Mhm.
want to be like, she spoke about wanting to be bitter, but then also recognizing that at least she has it now and she's happy to have it now. And it's better
Mhm.
than not having it for however many years she has left. Yeah, it was that conversation
Yeah.
really, really stuck with me.
Mhm. And it's I think this process of grieving, of making sense of accepting, and then putting it in a place that makes sense to move forward is a really important process, and one that we should, I mean, just highlight for people that it's a mixed bag. Diagnose any kind of our diagnoses, it's a mixed bag. It's like, oh yes, that makes sense,
Mhm.
and it's a yes and.
It's a yes and I think when I first, so I talked about that mourning period, but then things shifted for me in a way where there was a book that I read that frames it more as a superpower. And then I was so gung ho, like,
Yes,
this is the reason I was able to be a freelance journalist. And this is the reason I'm successful. Maybe it's the reason I didn't stay in one career path, but and all of a sudden I was attributing everything to ADHD. And then you sort of do come to a much more balanced, I'm much more at a point now where I don't see it as a deficit or a superpower. I see it as a way that my brain works. And I
mhm,
see
yeah,
understanding how my brain works as a really empowering thing
yes,
that, like it helps me approach new situations. It helps me approach relationships. It's helping me approach things. Um, but it's not dictating success or failure. Like it's not the
right,
thing that's
right,
causing things to go well or to
yes,
go poorly. It's just a
yes,
self-awareness.
totally, totally. My late diagnosis was dyslexia. Um, Finding out through all of our kids, and I'm doing the work, and of course,
Mhm.
I'm the last to know, for similar reasons. I mean,
Mhm.
different but similar reasons. Um, but like you, it was this process of, wow, what would it have been like if I would have known? How would have that impacted like my self-confidence, my
Mhm.
self-esteem when it came to school-related stuff? And also, wow, this makes a lot of sense, and it's empowering because there are the strengths, or as,
Yeah, I think there are.
Ned Howell
Yeah.
calls it, the superpowers, and
Mhm.
there are the deficits and challenges, and it's like understanding, and I feel it's understanding and
Mhm.
accepting all of it to have self-knowledge.
Yeah, and even in a way that I hope this comes out the right way, but I also see how neurotypical people have like there are strengths that come with that, and there are deficits that come with that, and that, but it's a way their brain works, right? And it's yeah,
Right.
so I've very much landed at that point where there was a moment, then you hear it at the beginning of episode 4, but there's a moment where I sort of stood back and was like, I don't know that having known this would have changed many of my choices. Like, I think that
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the choices I made, I would have understood why I was making those choices instead of feeling like it was the only choice I have. I have to quit this job right now. But I probably would have still made those choices. You know, so there's
Yeah.
just such an
Yeah.
interesting thing that
Yeah.
comes with self-awareness
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. You were taking me down memory lane because when I was in graduate school, so when I was in graduate school I started in 92, right? Where this was all happening. And my mentor was an ADHD expert. So I spent several
Wow.
summers and after school programs working at ADHD camps for kids.
Oh wow.
And the trainings that I was going to were Dr. Russell Barkley, right? The like
Wow.
old,
Okay.
like
Mhm.
like all the trainings, the big conference rooms.
Mhm.
Like he was the foremost authority. There were others, but the big one at the time, and all the books and all the workbooks. And then, as you met with Ned Howell and his wife, amazing people, and reference
Mhm.
John Rady, it's like they were almost like their 2.0, like their book 2.0 was kind of like the more less stigmatizing, more progressive view, moving into
Mhm.
the idea of before we really had the word of neurodiversity, but really calling
Yeah.
it about like these are different brains designed to do different things, guys.
Yeah,
Um,
and
and so it's this like kind of a dichotomy.
yeah, and it's really interesting because it's sort of like, um, you know, if you look back in history, there are people used to do very different things with their days, right? It's like it sort of makes sense. Like when you really start talking about I love the conversations on neurodiversity. There's
Mhm.
something that someone says to me at the very end. I didn't use the interview, but I mentioned something that a psychiatrist said to me, and he just talks about how I mean, we've only been using the word neurodiversity and talking about this concept for, I might get the year wrong, but I think it's since 1998 that we first really used the term and have only really
Sounds about right.
popularized it since about 2010, I think. And
Yeah,
he was like, I just think we're, you know, the conversation is going to continue to evolve into one where we say, at this particular moment in 2025, we can't even begin to comprehend the level of neurodiversity that exists in the world. And we need to categorize it. So we're categorizing it into a few types of brains, but there's probably thousands of types of brains. And I thought that was fascinating. And I want to continue to follow that
mhm.
research because, again, yeah, I think it can be so empowering to be able, whether you're saying it to kids or you're saying it to adults, and just saying different brains do things in different ways. And like none of the ways are wrong.
No, and we need all of them.
We
And we
need
need
all
all
of
of them.
them.
So this is where
Yeah.
I was wincing. So I want to hear what you have to say about this
Okay.
because there were several times in the episodes, um, your friend, I think it was Parker.
Hmm.
Is it
Hmm.
Parker? And others who were talking about, very lightly, um, yeah, I have a mental illness. And so mental illness was used multiple times. And I'm very
Yeah.
sensitive that being in the field of giving
Hmm.
diagnoses and being very conflicted. Um, when I think of ADHD, when I think of all the people I know with ADHD in my family, in my personal life, and in my professional life, I do not think of one of them as having mental
Yeah.
illness. I think of them having a neurodiversity that meets some criteria that if we label it, it helps with increased understanding, opens doors for treatment, meet their like, but mental illness, I have a
Illness.
problem with.
Yeah, no, I think that word, even as she said it in the interview, I debated whether or not to use that part of the interview because I think that it's sort of like, I think she first used it when she was describing the way she's trying to explain it to her mom, as in
Mm,
it like and I think that to speak for Parker, I'm hesitant to speak for her, but knowing her as well as I do, I think that she would even walk back the word mental illness if it's being interpreted as she thinks it's an illness. I think she's talking about the
right.
words that are used to like in the technical terms.
Yes.
But even towards the end of the episode, like she says that the advice she gave a family member about their younger child who has recently been diagnosed with ADHD is, your kid's going to be all right. He's got a superpower. Right. So I think
Hmm.
she was
Right.
using the terms that are used, but I hope that what we see over the next, I'm with you. I really want to see the terms change. I even want to see the idea that we can only get research funding for deficits change. You
Right.
know, like
Right.
I don't even like to hear it
Right.
called a deficit. So I'm with you. Mental illness is not,
Right.
and if there's
Right.
one thing I could change in the show, I might not have used that moment because I think it sort of trivializes something that neither of us meant to at all.
Well, no,
Yeah.
I'm actually glad you did, and this was, and my comment was nothing actually against. I was, because I think it was actually even more than Parker. It came up, and so it wasn't even a comment on Parker. It was a comment on how our society and the medical
Mm,
community does often see it as a mental illness because it's in the
yeah.
disorder, the
It,
manual of
yep.
mental health disorders, like a disorder,
You're right. And
which is
it's like,
different than a difference. Like
right.
we want to be very affirming and talk about, oh, this is a learning difference. This is a brain difference.
Yeah.
Well,
And it
it
comes
is,
down
but it
to
doesn't open any of the doors. It doesn't open any of the doors to all of that.
exactly. And it seems to me like that's something I want to change so much because it's like we have this not all of us individually, but as a society, there's sort of this mindset that, yeah, like, well, differences don't necessarily need support, but deficits do. And I don't
Hmm.
think that that's correct. Like I think
Right. Right.
so there's so many societal shifts that we need.
Oh
But
man.
I think that these conversations are working their way towards, I hope, something better, and empowering people to, at least on an individual basis, be able to advocate for themselves. And I mean, another societal level conversation that I really want to see happen is that the people with neurodivergence don't have to be advocating. Like, if we could redesign a lot of systems in ways that worked
Right.
to empower and um, I don't love the word optimize, but like to make it possible for
Right.
everyone to be doing their best
Right.
without having to
Right.
ask for it. I think that's where we need to be looking and going.
Totally. Totally. And that is completely in line with the neurodiversity movement. And we know
Yeah.
that organizations and corporations and businesses that embody that, they benefit from different kinds of minds. And those different kind of
Mhm.
minds might have different work settings or different workstations or, different
Mhm.
hours or where they need to be or when they need to be there. Like we know it works, and we know
Mhm.
progressive schools and educators, it's called like universal accommodation. Like there is no accommodation needed in some of these classrooms because everyone can move around, everyone
Mhm.
can have a little extra time. It's all about like knowledge acquisition as opposed to just short-term memory. So I, I
Exactly.
I'm so
Yeah.
with you, and I do think there is a lot of movement in,
I think
there
so.
both is and isn't happening right now at the same time.
Right, right. And it's just hoping that the movement continues to be funded, right? That it's like
Yeah.
but that was the thing that came up the most that you won't hear in the podcast at all, but interested, like, because there's a lot of conversations that I had that never made the final cut, but many of those conversations at some point turned to, well, what are the accommodations that are best for people with
Hmm.
ADHD? And it's sort of nascent research, so I can't even speak to like all of those. Any researcher who brought it up told me that's the thing they're starting to research, because when ADHD was first researched and understood, it was lumped into learning disabilities, and the accommodations became the same as other learning differences. And a lot of the researchers have said to me, I don't think that the accommodations for one learning difference are always going to be efficient or effective for another learning difference. But we haven't
Right.
put the time or effort or funding. I keep going back to funding, but we haven't had a chance to look at what actually is best for people with ADHD specifically, or for adults with ADHD and kids with ADHD, or boys
Right.
with ADHD and
Right.
girls with ADHD. Like there's a lot of categories.
Right. There's a lot still to learn, and one example is, I recall a study which, gosh, I don't know how many years now came out, but it was extended time on the SAT or the ACT for people with learning issues like dyslexia or versus
Mhm.
ADHD.
Mhm.
And what they were finding was it helped, let's say, for a learning issue to have extra time, but it wasn't necessarily helping if you had ADHD, because if you're having trouble paying attention, it just gives you like 6 hours to have trouble paying
This is
attention
exactly.
instead of 4, right? This is that like
Yeah.
we have to like fine tune this stuff.
No, and that's actually the exact one that came, not that exact study, but that concept of extra time and that as an accommodation for ADHD came up so often in conversations because, I mean, there was a researcher at King's College London who said she receives notes from the parents of college students who say, please stop giving my child extra time on papers because they're going to use every minute you give them, but they're not
Right.
gonna ever. So she was even, she's just starting to look into what is the most effective, but she's like, who knows, maybe people with ADHD need less time because they'll just do it
Mhm.
whenever the deadline is. And I can relate to that in a sense. I mean, deadlines are the reason I finish anything, like, and
Right.
whenever the deadline is when I'm going to finish it.
Oh yeah, I've had several clients who just say, "Do not get me more time. It's just going to make everything worse than it already
Exactly.
is."
It's
Right?
just
Like,
good.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And like any
yeah.
scheduling that's already happened is going to be out the window because I'm going to reschedule everything around the new deadline. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, right. Let's talk. So let's go into
Mhm.
social media. We got social media. We have AI. We have algorithms, and let's talk about like the good and the not so good aspects, because there is a lot of good. We can't throw it all out, and we have to be wary of those algorithms and what they're telling people also.
Yeah, I think that the good would be, yeah, the algorithms figuring out, like in episode 3, Parker talks about how the algorithm really helped point her towards ADHD, but then very interestingly, when she was assessed for ADHD, the next day the algorithm sent her even more targeted content, which was like specifically about ways that Black women with ADHD, Parker's a Black woman, so the ways that Black women with ADHD are often misdiagnosed. And Parker had never encountered any of that information before, but then it had happened during her own diagnostic
Hmm.
analysis. And so the algorithms were feeding her really important information, which we were joking, like, who would have thought the algorithms would ever be our advocate? But at the same time, and this doesn't come up much in the interview, but I think, or not, it doesn't come up in the episode, but I think it comes up everywhere, is that the algorithms are also keeping us in. Like, they know that we have ADHD, right? Like, Parker was telling me about, again, this isn't in the episode, but she told me about all of the things that she's bought because they've been fed to her on the out, like, because the algorithm knows this is a woman with ADHD. You might like this fidget spinner and this thing and that thing. And um, yeah, so I think the algorithms are really dangerous. I think like in some senses, they are also helpful in some senses. And it's like just like anything else, like any other innovation, we have to figure out how to use it as a tool, not to let it use
Hmm.
us. Um,
Hmm.
and also I think that's something that's really important to talk about with social media is the amount of misleading content that's on there. I
Hmm.
don't have the numbers in front of me. You might know the numbers better than me, but in the last month, I want to say, a new study came out showing that something like, it was a high percentage. I don't remember the percentage. I want to say it was 80 or above, but a high percentage of content labeled as ADHD traits on, or content labeled as ADHD content talking about ADHD traits on social media is actually talking about everyday human traits.
Yeah, behavior, human. Yeah,
Behavior.
exactly.
Yeah, human
Yeah, yeah,
behavior.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and I think that's something that, I get into this lightly in episode 4, but it is something that we have to think about, whether it's with social media or whatever it is. I don't know. There's a lot of people whose jobs now are talking about ADHD content, right? So, and they have to continue to
Right,
build an audience. So there is like a little bit of a, but that again is where I'm like, yeah, maybe that's true. And maybe it leads to some overdiagnosis because that's the question we grapple with in that episode.
right,
But ultimately, everybody encountering it is relating to it. So
right,
is it so harm? I don't know. Yeah.
right. It's we need to discern. We
Yeah.
really need to discern, because you're going to get on your feed. Do you lose your keys? You might have ADHD, and yes, that is very common. for people who have ADHD,
Yeah.
but also you don't have to have ADHD to lose your keys. Like
Right.
it's really looking at all of the the symptomatology, and the symptomatology through the lens of who you are, where you live, what your culture is. Um, so it's, and this is why it is seeking someone who's trained for
Mhm.
the actual diagnosis, right? Someone who, this is what they do,
Right.
hopefully a trusted referral,
Right.
because there are also, opportunist people who, like, we don't want the factories. We want the people who are really, this is like, they're really trying to accurately help people figure themselves out so they can move forward.
So that they can move forward and that they can really talk through the tools that then, because figuring it out is like maybe step 2, right? Like there's like so
Right.
much that comes before it. And then you want to think figuring it out is the final step, but it actually, as I've learned, is like really the
The
beginning of a
beginning.
whole nother.
The
Yeah,
beginning.
exactly. It's a
Yeah.
whole nother thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. For people who are listening and are new to this,
Hmm.
but are intrigued, give some themes, some common female themes of those who have lived with female ADHD and finally came to the diagnosis. Like, there are some major themes that seem to be commonalities.
Yeah. So some of the major themes are, I mean, I'm like, there's so many that I can list. I'm like, which one should I say first? One of the major things is that they say the areas where women with undiagnosed ADHD and with ADHD diagnosed struggle the most are relationships, careers, and parenting. Those are the top 3. And the sort of connective tissue between all of them does tend to be executive functioning skills, which is like staying organized, staying on top of things, staying scheduled, um, keeping your house clean. Prioritization is a big one. Um, Another major theme and I should just say, like, that can show up like in careers. It tends to show up with, I mean, my career is sort of like a case study
Mhm.
in undiagnosed ADHD. Like I switch jobs every um the longest I've ever stayed in a position was 2 years. Most of the time it was 1 year. Most of the time it was 4-month projects. I
Mm.
happened to choose a career that worked out with, but early on it didn't feel like I was ever getting anywhere. For like 10 years it felt like I was making lateral move after lateral move and never accomplishing anything. It can also look like emotional dysregulation is a very common theme with anyone with ADHD. But the way that can show up, or from what I've studied, it shows up for women is confrontations with coworkers or, yeah, just emotional dysregulation, not regulating your emotions even at work in ways that become detrimental for women. And I think especially there's expectations on women in the workplace that you're not going to show a ton of emotions. And then when you have these big emotional swings, it's even more so like, what do you do?
Mhm.
What's happening here? And then And yeah, other ways that it shows up. So the emotional dysregulation shows up a lot in relationships also.
Mhm.
Um, and then all of that sort of, I think the biggest one that shows up, and I sometimes hesitate to say this shows up for all women with undiagnosed ADHD, because talked to several women who say, I never felt shame, but I think shame is the other extremely
Mhm.
common thread. Um,
Yeah.
just feeling
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm never going to be able to figure this stuff out. Like, I think for me, I didn't feel a ton of it because I think every generation of women feels a little bit more empowered than some generations before them, and I did grow up at a time when it was like, "You're gonna have a career, you're gonna," like, I didn't have as much of the, societal expectations on me as a generation before me, but,
Mhm.
the self-doubt and the confusion and the, "Why can't I just figure all of this out?" was really mounting by 33, 34, to the point that it was like, there's something wrong with me. What's going on? And I
Right.
think
Right.
those questions of there's something wrong with me, like, will I ever be enough? Why can't I just figure out these things that everyone else seems to have figured out?
Right.
Are very common themes for women with
Yeah.
ADHD.
Yes. And then there are the confounding variables, um, which are trauma, and how trauma, um, produces dysregulation,
Mhm.
distractibility, all the anxieties that can come one with also with ADHD. And then as women are getting older without diagnosis, then there is perimenopause and menopause. So you have
Oh,
all the
yeah.
hormonal issues. So it does get it's complex. It
It's
can be
very
complex. Yeah.
yeah, it can be extremely complex, and, I yeah, the final episode of the series, episode 6, is where I start digging into these questions about the hormonal elements of ADHD and how hormonal shifts throughout the menstrual cycle, like, shift like, how symptoms, change based on where you're at in your cycle, and then how I mean, I'm just fascinated by the number of women who say, "I have not had these symptoms until I hit perimenopause," and, I think we need a lot more research on that. I think we need a lot of research on, uh the DSM is a diagnostic tool. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily perfect. It's based on
Right.
the
Right.
research that we have now. And, the DSM currently says symptoms of ADHD appear before the age of 12 or by the age of 12, I think it is.
Hmm.
And I think what's happening with a lot of women challenges that notion. Um
Right. And that was changed in the previous DSM when I was growing up
Mhm.
professionally. It was by age 7.
Yep.
Right? So then you'd get these teenagers coming in and people be like, "Well, they're past the criteria. It can't be. It must be something else. It
Mhm.
must be situational. It must be anxiety. It must be." So that's been bumped to 12 with the latest research at that time, and you're right. Like, where are we going? Um, why does it have to be seen? Like, the markers are helpful for different
Mhm.
diagnoses developmentally to, like, sort of guide us for specific diagnoses. However, particularly with masking, that it might not show up
Yeah.
till later. And what we find at our center, where we work with lots of bright individuals, creative, gifted, twice exceptional, there's often not diagnoses in any categories of learning, neurodiversity, until high school, college, graduate school, beyond, because of the compensation and the masking. So that doesn't mean
Right.
they never had it. It just wasn't.
Right.
It didn't express itself in a negative way.
Right, it didn't expect and it's such a tricky thing. I get tripped up on this, and I'm speaking entirely for myself, not for understood.org. Like, there is
Yep.
a team of experts at understood.org that are much more, qualified to speak to this. But, for me personally, I get really tripped up on it because it is I'm blanking on the word that I'm looking for, but it is a diagnosis that's based on feelings of impairment. Right? And so it's like a lot of people say they don't feel it, and it's like, well, is it that they didn't feel it before, or is that it hadn't developed yet? I don't know. And, like, based on hormones, and so I get tripped up on that, but I know that
Mhm.
it's the current understanding is that it was there all along, but, it yeah, the masking or it wasn't impairing them to a point a clinical definition of impairment.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's the tricky thing with the diagnostic manual. Like, we have all of these human characteristics and behaviors, and another problem that many of us had when the latest big manual came out. It was a while back now, like 10 plus years ago.
Mhm.
Was the diagnostic categories grew like up to like 500 and something, like exponential new diagnoses, new criteria. And to your earlier point, it was like, all of a sudden grieving is a mental disorder, like
Right,
human,
like yeah.
like how is everything a mental disorder? Like, this is like human
Right.
reaction. So basically, one of the things we're always talking about is, does it cause functional impairment, is the fancy word. Like, is it
Mhm.
really impairing your ability to live and to carry out your tasks? And I think that is an important question when we're looking at all of this stuff.
One of my favorite things is when I first called my mom and was talking through this with her, my mom when I first called her to talk about my diagnosis, her first reaction was, that's impossible. You were so good in school. There's just no way." And then, in the next conversation, she was sort of like, "Fine, maybe your generation has this, but mine didn't." And then it, like,
Right. Yeah.
slowly went into, "Well, what's a normal brain anyway?" And she was finally like,
Yeah.
"Who's normal? Like, I don't understand." And I do think about that a lot where it's like, yeah, like you're saying, like, if all of these are quote unquote mental disorders, like, who's not disordered at this point? And
Right.
who doesn't have at least
Right.
yeah. And Yeah, so I find it all really interesting, and I think one thing we didn't talk about at all in the podcast that someone brought up to me the other day is that, in talking about the rise in diagnosis of anything, um, I think the number is 53% of Gen Z identifies as neurodivergent, and I found that so interesting
Mm,
because I think they have done away with the stigma. I think as a generation, they're doing a phenomenal job of not stigmatizing, um,
right.
and so I
And
don't
they
know what
own
that
it. I
and
mean,
they
they
own it.
total many of them totally own it. Yeah.
Yeah, they totally own it, and they don't see it as a deficit in themselves. It's
Mhm.
a trait, and,
Right.
I just find that so interesting, and that's not something I really was focusing in Climbing the Walls, I really was looking at sort of the generation of women who were missed, as opposed to the generation who have known since childhood, and, I mean,
Mhm.
Gen Z, when we're talking about adult women, that does include Gen Z, but I'm sort of talking about the generations, I guess, that came before them, but I do think
Mhm.
that yeah, it was just interesting to hear someone asked me, "How does that 53% of Gen Z factor into the rise in diagnosis of women?" And I said, "To be honest, I have to call myself out on this. I didn't look at that." Um,
Mm.
but it's really interesting to think about. I don't know if we'll reach a point where 80% of people are diagnosed as neurodivergent. I don't know what any of that means. It's just an interesting moment that's,
It is an
yeah,
interesting
coming up.
moment, and there are have been conversations for some time with the rise of neurodiversity in all of the different names and categories that we have, because we know all of them do have strengths that come with them. We tend to
Mhm,
unfortunately focus too much on the weaknesses and challenges. But like, is this the evolution of our human species? Right?
mhm.
This like these are different brains designed to do different things. We're at a technology age which is changing our brains, particularly young people's brains who now grow up with computers in their
Mhm.
hands and computers at school. Like, we know the attention span is different. We know people read differently. We know people like it is changing neural networks.
Yeah,
Are just
yeah,
our culture that we are in.
yeah. I often think when we're talking about the strengths and just the differences, I just wish we could go back to a time when work looked so different for so many different people and to just study the brains of like people who were in completely different industries or before we even had the industrial age. I don't know. I wish we could kind of
Mhm,
like go back in time and study those brains and see that they all worked differently and that's how people ended up in such different lifestyles. But
mhm.
but yeah, it's interesting to see how technology is changing. Yeah, I don't know. The brain has a hard time. I think evolution has a hard time keeping up with the pace of technological advance. So it's just
Yes.
interesting to,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, to
Yeah.
pay attention to it all right now.
Yeah. All right, so let's for people who
Mhm.
curious, let's talk
Mhm.
about diagnosis and how you get a diagnosis. Because there's lots of different ways, right? There is the one-time visit, there's the testing. So talk about what you have found.
Yeah, so I personally was diagnosed towards the end of the pandemic when telehealth was, the limits on telehealth. I think some of the restrictions have come back at this point, but
Most
in
of
the
them,
beginning of
unfortunately, have.
most
Yeah,
of them
most of them
have, right?
have.
So,
Yeah.
okay, so in the beginning of 2022 and throughout the pandemic, I was able to call a psychiatrist, get a telehealth appointment with her. We had one video conversation, in which she diagnosed me, and then, um, I would meet with her sort of like once a month to once every 2 or 3 months, um, to keep talking through ADHD, but I'm actually not entirely familiar with the process for children right now, but I know
Yeah.
that the telehealth process has become much more difficult because we've seen a lot of the telehealth companies, unfortunately, were putting profits over patient care,
Mhm.
and encouraging diagnosis. But right now, my understanding is that the diagnosis is I would recommend there's this self screener that's available. I believe it's from the World Health Organization. I know it's sort of all over the internet. It's definitely on the website for NYU's Adult Center for ADHD. That's where I found
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
Um, so there's that diagnostic screener, and then if you're seeing a therapist, it's great to talk to a therapist about it and then ask them for a referral to a psychiatrist. You can also ask a general physician. I think you can ask anyone for a referral to a psychiatrist, but the process
Hmm.
is not all that complicated in a way that shocked me. Because when I went into it,
Right.
I think I thought it would take months. You might be able to describe the process better than me, actually.
Well, no,
I don't
you're
know.
so you're
Yeah.
right about from the adult. You are right from the adult perspective. So it can be simple, and I do agree. For people who are interested, like the World Health Organization, they're a screener, see where you fall, because then it's like, huh, this is where I fall. I should go talk to a licensed professional, and then it can be your general practitioner, your
Mhm.
internist, or it could be a referral to psychiatry, depending on the health system. And with adults, it can be through a very thorough um, interview of not only the symptomatology of looking with these quantitative measures, but also like your life. If you have someone who's asking the right questions, you can see where the patterns are. For kids, we do lots of more in-depth testing because kids can have so many different. There's not enough life there. That is it a
Mm.
learning issue? Is it a processing issue, which ADHD can be, but it could be an auditory processing issue? Is it,
Right.
there's so many things. Is it anxiety? Like, what is getting in the way? So that's when we do a lot of neuroed and neuropsych testing. And what I have found is what we've recently launched at our center is a targeted adult ADHD assessment, which is a combination, only like clinical interview and then 2 hours of testing where we're actually
Hmm.
measuring auditory attention, visual attention, auditory processing, and executive functioning to match those sorts of abilities for a holistic look with everything else to be like, okay, does this land? Does this fit? So it's a little more
Huh.
comprehensive than the interview, but still time, more affordable and less time intensive.
Yeah, I it's amazing to hear that that exists. I would have loved more thorough testing than what I had, to be honest, because it was sort of like,
Mhm.
a lot of the questions were questions that you can also I don't know. I would have loved a more thorough,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, well, I'm
analysis,
glad to hear
but
you say
yeah,
that. I'm glad you because it's important though for people to get an accurate diagnosis. So
it's so important. Yeah,
that's
so important.
important, and more information can often be more helpful, right? So it's both.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
would also say, I think something I would add to it all too is that if the cost is the hurdle to a diagnosis, something I found is that, like we talked about this a little bit earlier, but medication is one of the many incredible tools in the ADHD, the approach to ADHD or the ADHD toolkit, if you will. And
Hmm.
if the yeah, if the cost of diagnosis, like, for me to see the psychiatrist, my insurance wasn't covering it. I ended up paying $500 for an initial appointment, and that was a
Hmm.
lot to think about. Like, the cost is
Yeah.
prohibitive for a lot of people, and I think
Hmm.
that if you're dealing with the cost feeling prohibitive, I would highly recommend, like, for women, I would recommend Sari Solden and Michelle Frank's workbook, The Radical Guide for Women with ADHD, and if it's hitting home to the point, for a lot of women, they say when they first read it, they're in tears. And it's a workbook where you're working through your own life experiences on the page with them. That book is $15. So hopefully that's not cost
Right.
prohibitive, right? Compared to an expensive appointment. And I'm not saying that works as a diagnosis by any means, but I think it helps you see if before you invest $500 into an appointment, you can kind of see if it is more likely. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is I would go beyond TikTok and social media and some of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
information that's out there. And
Right.
and before making the investment in the analysis, if that's a tough thing to do,
Yes.
even just for a lot of people with ADHD, the time it takes to set up those appointments can be the thing that's prohibitive. So if you can buy a $15 workbook and kind of get a sense of the value of it for you, I think that's helpful. And I think you start to see some of the other tools, or have a meeting with an ADHD coach that's much more affordable than a
Right.
psychiatrist at first, right? And Yeah,
Well,
explore the diagnosis.
and you often
Yeah.
don't need you often don't need the psychiatrist, which, when things are more when not complex, psychiatry is very good for complexity. But
Mhm.
what I agree with you. You get the book, you get the workbook, this resonates, you fill out the free online form, like, "Wow, I'm ticking up on this." You
Mhm.
schedule an appointment with your primary healthcare provider and
Yep.
have the conversation because often they
Right.
can prescribe. They can diagnose
Right.
and they can prescribe.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there's a lot of yeah, there's a lot of paths towards an accurate diagnosis, and like you
Mhm.
said, the most important part is the accurate diagnosis. Um, yeah.
Okay, as we're winding down, I don't wanna
Mhm.
we've just dabbled into medicine, and I don't want to gloss over it. So,
Mhm.
because it is such a, often important part of ADHD treatment and is often controversial depending on which media news and what who's talking about it. So what
Yeah.
did you learn? Like, I'm just curious if you could tell us what did you learn about the current viewpoint on medicine from the people you talk to, and I'm curious in your own personal life what your experience was to share.
Yeah, so I'll start with the viewpoint I learned from a lot of the experts was that they use it as a tool. So especially in adult life, it's not for many of them, it's not something that they say that patients need to take at the exact same time, same amount every day. Like even from my first appointment with a doctor, my psychiatrist said to me, if you don't feel like taking it on weekends, don't take it on weekends. If there's a day where you're trying to come up with a new uh, project proposal and you think you're more creative without it, just don't take it. If there's a day when you have to be really good at scheduling, take it. And so she sort of spoke to me right from the get go that,
Mm,
especially for adults, like this is a tool that you can use and you don't have to think of it. It's most, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but stimulants are short acting. They don't stay in your bloodstream. And is
right.
that, am I still correct in
Yeah, that
that?
you can get. There's 4 hours is the original short acting pill, and then the extended release can be up to 12 hours.
Yeah, so my doctor talked about that right away, and she was like, "Don't feel like it's not that you have to get on it and then see if 2 weeks later it's having any impact." She's like, "You're gonna know if it's having an impact very quickly, and
Yeah.
also the impact is going to wear off pretty quickly, so you're gonna feel a difference." And then so I would say, yeah, most of the experts, are most of them are taking it themselves, and they're very open to patients who don't wanna take it, they're open to patients who wanna take it. The experts I spoke with at least were very much, um, into individualizing it, so seeing what works best for each patient, and they had some patients who have been on it for a decade and taking it every day. They had some patients who take it twice a year, some people told me.
Mhm.
Like, it's very much, it's like that, and then for me personally, when I was first diagnosed, I was taking it somewhat religiously, and then I sort of and I had convinced myself that now that I understood this, this is the only way I could get through days, and this was gonna fix everything that had been wrong, like,
Mm,
forever,
right.
and, meanwhile, I still went to South America for 4 months because I didn't feel like being in New York, so it wasn't fixing, like, that impulse, but while I was in South this is a yeah, this is just my personal story, but while I was there, I ran out of, I was taking Ritalin, and I ran out, and I spiraled harder than I've ever spiraled into somewhat of a depressive state. Like my therapist was like,
Mhm,
this isn't, I wouldn't say it's depression, but it's depressive. It's a depression like.
mhm,
And that was a huge wake up call for me that I was treating this as if medication was the only answer. And then that's when I first read Ned Hallowell and John Rady's book, ADHD 2.0, and got a new perspective on things. Um, that's when I actually, it was a year after that, that I found Sari Solden's book through a friend. A friend recommended it. Um, but I reached a point where my relationship with medication is very much as a tool when needed. But, I also did a ton of research on exercise and the brain, And I've always been an
John
active
Rady.
person.
John Rady,
John
very big
Rady.
on that. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, John Rady, my interview with John Rady unfortunately didn't make it into the final series, but I spent a day in Michigan with John Rady, and um, I very much think of exercise as medication now, and I am more dedicated to a 20 to 30 minute, like even if it's a stationary bike, so it's just something every morning, or if it's a
Yeah.
walk. I'm not starting my day without, and I think of that as a, my brain's not going to function the same way
Yeah.
without this
Yeah.
workout. It's like, it's really not about what my body looks like. It's about how my brain functions. So yeah, that's been my
Yeah.
relationship with medication, is
Cool.
learning all the other stuff.
Thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that. And John Rady's book, if I recall, was it Spark? Was the
Spark,
name
and
of
it's a phenomenal
Spark?
book. Yeah. Yeah.
Phenomenal, everyone. And all these books, everything that Danielle's mentioned will be in the show notes. And the research
One
on movement was incredible in that book, Spark. And it's changed the way uh, different states and countries do things as a result of the
yeah,
research.
it really has. And he, a very easy to remember, I think, stat that he had told me was that more than 60% of brain function is activated by movement. And when you hear that,
Mm,
it's like, yeah, I mean, he and Ned talk about the importance of human connection, just strong connections with other people, movement,
mhm,
and I forget, but they have one other one that's like their three, love. They talk about love within
mm.
connections, but just how important those things are for the brain.
Awesome.
Just at a,
Awesome.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, connection. Your podcast is connecting connecting the dots for a lot of people, and it's connecting people, connected us. I'm so grateful for you doing this and for understood putting this out in such a I mean, I know this is your field, so it's such a professional production. So
Thank you.
it's clear your expertise in that too. I mean, just the production is so engaging. What in closing, what do you want for this series, and for the future?
Yeah, so for I what I really want is I would say two things, right? I want people to believe women, because I have heard so much doubt from people about, oh, well, isn't everyone being diagnosed with ADHD? If I hear that one more time, it's almost like people are like, oh, well, I've heard that from every woman I know. And it's like, well, maybe you know a lot of women who had undiagnosed ADHD. There are a lot of us out there. So I really want people to understand the experience women are having more. Um and then I really, the people who are in the position to fund research into ADHD, I really want them to understand the need to continue. I just think that adult women need to be researched and haven't been for a very
Mhm,
long time.
mhm,
And even right now, the studies that we have on ADHD and hormones max out at, I think the age group is 18 to 23 in one of the most recent studies, which is exciting. That study has been talked about at conferences, but not yet actually
mm.
published. Um, but 23 is hardly the end of adulthood, right? So it's like the
Yes,
very, very, like the
yes,
beginning of it. So we
yes,
need more. We need thorough
yes,
research on ADHD and perimenopause and menopause and postmenopause. And um, yeah, we need so much more research.
yes. Yes, and it's 2025, everyone, and we are currently calling it ADHD. It's probably its sixth name since the 50s. And as we continue to grow in our understanding of brains and humanity and neurodiversity, who knows what we're going to call this in the
Who
next
knows?
5, 10 plus years. So
Yeah.
we'll be open to that. Danielle, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Tell everyone where to find the podcast and actually what all the other stuff you're doing.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. This was
Yeah.
fun. The podcast is called Climbing the Walls. You can find it anywhere that you get your podcasts. So Apple, Spotify, any of the platforms. And it's 6 episodes. All episodes are now out. So yeah, it's, yeah, Climbing the Walls from understood.org. And understood.org is also a phenomenal resource with um so much expert information out there.
So
Um,
much. Yeah.
So much. Yeah. And then my other work is sort of all over the place. There's a series I just produced for ESPN that came out last week. There's a true crime podcast that I'm working on. There's a book that I'm working on. It's very, yeah,
Part of
it's
your
sort of all over the
superpowers.
place.
Part of your superpowers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Very
but
cool.
thank you. This was so much fun.
Well, thank you, and best of luck in everything.
Thank you.
What an engaging and enlightened conversation with Danielle, who just brings this topic of ADHD in women to life with not only her research, but her own personal story. Here are 5 key takeaways. Number 1, self-discovery is a lifelong process. Danielle's ADHD diagnosis at 36 was a turning point, reminding us that it's never too late to understand our minds and break free from outdated narratives. Number 2, masking is real. Many women unknowingly mask their ADHD symptoms, blending in with societal expectations while silently struggling. 3, it's not just you. If you felt a sense of shame or otherness in your life, you're not alone. This journey is shared by millions, and awareness is the first step towards change. Number 4, neurodiversity is a strength. Our brains are wired differently, and that's a powerful thing. Embracing this truth can be a source of immense personal strength. And number 5, advocacy matters. The need for more research and better understanding is critical for future generations, ensuring that fewer women feel overlooked or misunderstood. Thank you for listening to this important show on a very critical and important topic. As you heard during the show, our center, Summit Center, does provide adult ADHD evaluations in a targeted form and also comprehensive evaluations for kids. If you're interested, look at www.summitcenter.us. Thank you for being a part of our community, for subscribing, for your 5-star reviews. And remember, we have this moment, this day, and this life. Let's make it a great one. This has been a Peters and Rossi production. Make It a Great One with Dr. Dan is produced by Laura Rossi. Our engineer is Phil Rossi. Theme music is Uplifting Folk by Awesome Music. Artwork by Kelly Dwyer. Follow us on social media at Dr. Dan Peters. For more information, visit drdanpeters.com.